Hey guys, this is just a quick lesson. It's part of the bigger civil rights movement that we're going to be talking about. I'm going to give you kind of a introduction to it. I know I gave you a bunch of worksheets last week, but let's get into this PowerPoint because I think this is a super important time in our history. It's kind of our second civil war, but mostly nonviolent and not having to fight a war like the Civil War, but it is important. So, first, I'm going to give you kind of what led up to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, um, and see where it goes today. And we're going to talk mostly from the black perspective, just because, excuse me, just because that's where most of our civil rights stem from, is just our slavery being held, but also we will look at Hispanic, LGBT, just all of the different kind of groups that were affected during this movement. So, but it is mostly from the black perspective. So there is that. So, civil rights movement, these essential questions, remember, you have to do these, answer them, put them on a Google Doc, turn them into the classroom. So, what impact did Dred Scott have, and the Emancipation Proclamation have on early struggles for civil rights? 14th Amendment, um, what gains did the movement make in desegregating schools, public, and then goals of civil rights movement. And some of these you can answer because we won't go through them in this lesson. That's fine. We will answer them when we get there. So just be aware of that. And then there's this. So we're going to first start with kind of the origins of civil rights, where we did have slavery. We had slavery for until we were from colonies all the way up until the 13th Amendment. And one of the big pushes for civil rights is through the Dred Scott case. And so I know this is kind of eighth grade and not really this contemporary U.S. history, but we got to know our history to know our more recent history. So Dred Scott was a slave, and his master moved to a free territory and lived there for several years and kind of moved around. And after his owner died, he kind of sued for his freedom because he was living in this like free state, and he lost in the state and federal court system, and then it moved all the way up to the Supreme Court. So in 1857, so this is three years from kind of the outbreak of the Civil War, this case happens, and this is just kind of the match that starts kind of our separation from North and South. And so, the Dred Scott case, this is Chief Justice Robert B. Taney, the guy who wrote the decision for the Dred Scott case. And it's one of the worst in American history. It's always ranked up there. But the opinion written by Taney was essentially that it's like, since he was a slave, he wasn't actually a citizen. He was property. He wasn't a person. And so he didn't have the right to sue the court. And he also said that the Missouri Compromise, which was essentially anything below this Missouri Compromise line, anything south of it is a slave state, anything north, it got rid of slave state, free state essentially, and it gave kind of like slavery this open arm of like, hey, we can go anywhere with our property. It doesn't matter if that property is a person. Also, Taney said that he could not give citizenship to these slaves because then they were protected under the Constitution, which meant that they would have the freedom of speech, they would have the right to bear arms, they had right to a jury trial, all the stuff that he did not want to give these slaves. So it's a multifaceted. But in if you ever get a chance, just look up the decision by Justice Taney, and he has a lot of interesting stuff to look in, where it's not really, it's like, well, I hate black people. Well, it is kind of, but it's just more of like, here's the legalness of this racism. And so he does this, and then the war breaks out 3 years later, after this decision, and the Emancipation Proclamation is essentially this. announcement in 62 after one of the worst battles in the Civil War that essentially said, "Hey, I am going to free the slaves in these territories in rebellion, but not the border states, because if I do that, the border states, which are still kind of a part of the Union, who have slaves, they would probably not like that." So he is playing this like teeter totter game, and this is just a very symbolic measure because he can't really enforce it without winning the war. And so, and during this Emancipation Proclamation, he had to contradict himself a whole lot because he said on his campaign that he would not like free the slaves if he didn't have to. And he ends up doing it with the Emancipation Proclamation, kind of. He also said that like the states are in rebellion and not really separated, and he kind of flip flopped on that. He also freed the slaves in these rebellion southern states, but not the border states. Also, it was part of the thing that he had to say that they were property, even though he supported Dred Scott and he supported this man's freedom and worked with people like Frederick Douglass to help get citizenship and just rights to black people who were slaves. And he essentially had to say that this is property and the US military can seize this property of this contraband that this territory in rebellion has. And so that was kind of this real kind of mixing of things. And it kind of got him in some trouble where some people said that he might not have the constitutional power to do this. And so this was a very big this moment in Lincoln's presidency. And so this leads to the Civil War amendments. Abraham Lincoln is only alive for one of them, and that's the passing of the 13th Amendment, which is the abolishment of slavery. If you get a chance, look at Lincoln. If you haven't seen it, Lincoln, great movie. It talks about the passing of this amendment and just how hard it was to get it passed in the North, because not everyone in the North was for freedom, and just how hard it was to get America away from this kind of disease of slavery. And then after this, the 14th Amendment was passed. This granted any person citizenship and equal protection under the law and access to due process. And then also the 15th Amendment gave African American men the right to vote. And so these are very important things that we use today. The 14th Amendment maybe being the most important out of all of them. And when we get later into this, the 14th Amendment is kind of always used as, hey, we have the 14th Amendment. This is very important, all that. And then the Supreme Court, though, only ruled that this applied to the federal government, not the states. And because they said it only applied to federal government, the states were able to have this segregation, this power to kind of ignore some of these things. And so this is where you get like kind of the back half of Free State at Jones, where people in the South after the Civil War took these freed slaves and essentially put them in apprenticeships, which were essentially the same thing as slavery, but it's like, hey, I'm giving this person a job, I'm teaching them something. And it was just like, it was impossible to kind of override the states. And that's kind of this fault of the Supreme Court saying it only applied to the federal government, not the states. Jim Crow laws, Jim Crow, named after a minstrel show character, and it was just essentially this huge thing where it mandated blacks and whites separation. And then here in Texas, you also had the white water fountain, and then the blacks and the Latino water fountain. It wasn't just black people segregated; it was also Hispanics and people like Asians in California and Native Americans as well. Just everyone that wasn't white was separated in these facilities. And then black facilities obviously were not taken care of. They were probably used as like for a water fountain, like, oh, my dog can drink out of this water fountain. And obviously dogs can't really use water fountains that well, and so they're like licking the like faucet and all this stuff and not making it clean for people to drink afterwards. And it was just this horrible state of affair. And then we get to again another horrible Supreme Court case, and it's Plessy versus Ferguson. We talked about this, but again, more background. So this was involving train facilities in Louisiana, and it's like, hey, is there a case to segregate people in the train areas? And the court essentially said it's like as separate but equal, did not violate the 14th Amendment. So as long as they're equal, this allowed segregation. So, for instance, it's like I have like two phones, and it's like I have a phone from the 1970s, like a cell phone front that I can only hook up into the car, and then I have my new, like I have my phone, my smartphone. They're they're separate and they're equal because they're both phones, even though the 1980s like car phone is not as good as my Motorola. So this is just one of those things that you see the southern states kind of abuse. And then Justice Harlan is the only dissenting judge, so he's the only one who disagreed with this interpretation of the court case, and um, he essentially said that this is wrong, and that we like this will lead to what we know as segregation, and it obviously we can't say that it's equal because people like what is equal. Some say it is exactly the same, so it's like if I get two books they have to be the exact same, but not all things are created equal in some people's eyes. So there's just it's hard to have this separate but equal actually be equal. And so you have people rising up during this time, really speaking out for black people to get educated and to be involved. And you get Booker T. Washington, and he said that we should assimilate into the world of work. So he said we should learn by being able to work and learn skills, because how we're going to prosper is to be educated, be smart, and to be able to do these technical jobs. And then you have Webb Du Bois, and also Booker T. Washington established the Tuskegee Institute, which was a technical school for African Americans. And then you have Webb Du Bois. He said that black people should get a liberal arts education. So that's reading, that's learning your history, that's all like writing, literature, music. You should be able to learn cultural stuff and grow the black culture. And he later goes on to co-found the NAACP. And so these two men had very two different ideas that were almost, you could fit them both together, but they believed in two different ways of being prosperous. One is by writing, making literature, being a voice like Du Bois. And then Booker T. Washington was like, hey, let's learn skills, let's make stuff, let's help the world out by showing our worth. And so you get the New Deal and civil rights. And so FDR, not a great friend of civil rights. He never really did anything outstanding for it, and the New Deal didn't really help a whole lot. And so a lot of them discriminated against black people in who got funds. And again, the New Deal, this thing during the Great Depression. So the Great Depression was not a thing that affected just white people or just black people. It affected everyone. It didn't discriminate on what you looked like. It was just like just everything sucks right now. We all are losing our jobs. We're trying to put food on the table, and the government making this new deal is really just helping out white people and just really discriminative against blacks. And so you had these tenant farmers and sharecroppers really trying to get the New Deal with the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, trying to get um, loans for their farms and trying to get money to help support them instead of just failing. And these didn't really work. Um, but A. Philip Randolph, a person who was very much for civil rights and just getting a fair shake in this New Deal, said we're gonna march on Washington. And if you can read this, it says 1,500 Negroes assembled in St. Louis, 20,000 assembled in Chicago, 23,500 assembled in New York, and there's millions across the United States wanting to be free from Jim Crow, from fear, and from want. Which this is kind of this echo towards. This is echo from FDR, which it's like, hey, we should be free of these fears, and they're essentially saying, yeah, we do too. It's not just a white person problem; it's also affecting us. And then you have Eleanor Roosevelt, which she was a very outspoken person for civil rights, unlike her husband. She worked to promote civil rights in every way, shape, or form because her husband couldn't. Because her husband said that, like, if I'm this person the during World War II, essentially, saying we need equal rights and stuff, this might hurt the war effort. So I'm just gonna like lay my hands off it. Also, I'm not gonna be for anti-lynching because that's gonna hurt me in my Democratic Party because the Democrats are very much for these like being able to lynch black people because the KKK and all of these white supremacist groups are stemmed from the Democratic Party. And Roosevelt got nominated because he said he wouldn't pursue anti-lynching laws. And so his wife publicly supported anti-lynching bills. And the thing is, she could go out and do that because she's not really an elected official. She didn't have any power like her husband. And so she was able to garner huge support because even though she wasn't elected, being the wife of the president still gives you a lot of leeway. People will listen to you because you already have this platform of the president and you're just right there. And she's kind of one of the more active first ladies we have, being active in the role of making legislation, helping the president out. She was a very educated woman. She had the Black Cabinet, which is like people coming together and it's like, hey, how do we help with civil rights? And then she resigned her Daughters of the American Revolution over the Anderson affair, which Anderson is this lady who she's a black opera singer who wasn't allowed to sing at the Constitutional Hall. And so Eleanor Roosevelt, being a daughter of the American Revolution, she's like, hey, I'm giving this up because y'all are racist. I'm going to leave. And like, that's a big deal to give up your Daughters of the American Revolution membership because it's just essentially saying, it's like, hey, I don't like this organization because they don't stand up for what the founding fathers wanted with everyone being equal, stuff like that. And then this continued to work for civil and human rights after FDR's death. She lived many years after FDR succumbed to his illnesses, and she was this huge civil rights activist, like just being up like for anything to promote equality with with blacks, Hispanics, everyone. And so, with that, we're going to talk about blacks in World War II. And this is an interesting thing because they are treated. It's a weird concept, but like over 1 million people, black people served in the military in different roles, and they mostly were these dangerous menial jobs. One of them being like loading ammunition onto ships, and they were kind of treated like mules essentially. And so this port Port of Chicago disaster, there was a huge group of African Americans really, really just like trying to load this ammunition in. They're like the people who were in charge. It's like, hey, you got to load this faster, faster, faster. And the thing is, they made a mistake. An explosion happened. There's a lot of people who were killed during this. And then after this kind of settled, they didn't they're like, we're not going to do what you want as fast because we're going to take our time. We don't want another disaster to happen. And a lot of these African Americans were court-martialed or even like punished for mutiny. And so it took all the way to 1990 for all of these people in the Port Chicago disaster to be pardoned by the presidents preceding this moment because they were like unlawfully discharged from or like unfairly discharged from their military service because they weren't willing to do something risky. And then you have the Tuskegee Airmen. This is the first Black Marine Corps. They did flying missions and they had a whole bunch of stuff being involved with this, and they did air raids in dangerous parts of the European front, like bombing Germany and just being involved in that arena of the war. And then you have the double V campaign, which the V campaign was brought by the War Committee, saying it's like, hey, this is a victory campaign. Have your have your victory gardens, buy your war bonds, help like secure this victory over Nazi Germany, over Japan, over Italy. Let's try to like bond together. And then the black community had the double V, which they're like, hey, we're all for this. We all want this to happen, but also we're going to fight here at home for our civil rights. We're going to show that we're worth our salt. We're really wanting to have a meaningful contribution to this war effort, but you got to show us some respect. And the thing is, they're trying their hardest to really get these rights, and it's just a little bit too early for the civil rights movement to happen because a lot of people's like, hey, why are you creating such a ruckus? We're at war. And then there's desegregating the military. So this is um, this is important after World War II. Blacks are coming home from the war and they're being attacked by people that they served. In Louisiana, like a bunch of black people were beaten by police and blinded because of being beaten just because they were on the wrong part of town. And then President Truman had a committee on civil rights. It's like, well, how can we have desegregating? And he proposed the Executive Order 9981. This ended segregation in the military because up until this time, only 5% of the U.S. military was was desegregated, and so this made it official across all branches of the military that you can't segregate a unit based on race. And so this is one of the big things. This is shortly after when Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier and was the first black person to be desegregated into anything, and that was baseball. And so discussion questions, look at these, um, answer them for yourself, put them on a Google Doc, email them to me, do whatever you need to do to answer these. And early school segregation cases, this is a big thing because education's key. And what a lot of people were doing in the South was segregating these schools. And it wasn't just happening in the South, it was happening in New York, Boston, all these places. And there were just segregation in the 1950s, and school was the prime example of this is segregation. And so you had Sweet versus Painter, Loren versus Oklahoma State Regents of Higher Education. And so these were kind of frameworks for 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education case. So these were cases that were brought to the Supreme Court that kind of weakened segregation in schools, and then Brown versus the board really kind of set home. And so, where did Brown versus the board? This is one of, again, a landmark case. This was huge in um, this was huge in a lot of different places. So if you look at this map, this education segregation, like it was required in the South, optional or limited in the blue. There's no legislation on segregation, but it happened probably like it happened in a lot of these states. And then green, it was forbidden, but it took a long time for it to get forbidden in a lot of these states. And so Brown versus the Board of Education, it was like, hey, we're going to overturn this Kansas law that allowed segregation in schools. And the NAACP, they recruited Brown, this family, and a bunch of other families to enroll their kids in the nearest home or the nearest school near their homes, and those schools being white schools. And so they targeted these schools. They're like, okay, we're going to go here because I can't take my kid to the black school, which is across town. And so the school refused because it's like, we're just not going to let black people here because we're segregated, all this. And the NAACP came in, filed the suit, and it lost in the district court, and it eventually got appealed up to the state, up to federal courts, and all the way to the Supreme Court. And this is very important how we view this is just how federalism works. It's like, okay, you lose this case, we're going to move it up, we're going to move it up, we're going to move it up, and it finally gets to the Supreme Court because you have to follow kind of this federalism of court cases. And the guy who represents Brown and the people in the suit is Thurgood Marshall before he becomes the first African American Supreme Court justice. So he's a grandson of a slave. So this is two generations, like we're in the 1950s, this is two generations removed from slavery, and we're in the 1950s. The Civil War in the 1860s. We're two generations away, or like removed from slavery. But it's like you can still, like, it's like Thurgood Marshall will tell stories about how his like grandparents were slaves, and he was kind of their chief counsel, like the head like attorney for the NAACP. And so he wins this Brown case, and this kind of propels him into the national spotlight, and it eventually gets him a seat on the Supreme Court. So like 13 years later, he is appointed to the Supreme Court under Johnson. Johnson. He dies in 1993, so like he dies in the year that I was born. So again, Thurgood Marshall again is still kind of this very relevant person. We've only had two black Supreme Court justices, him and Clarence Thomas, who's still in the Supreme Court, who replaced Thurgood Marshall after he retired. And so the NAACP's argument for the Brown case is that under the 14th Amendment, that everyone's a citizen. This was misinterpreted, like segregation was misinterpreted in Plessy versus Ferguson, and it prohibited state level discrimination. Like you can't discriminate on the state level because it's just like you just can't, because that's what this 14th Amendment's about. And then also, it did not guarantee state discrimination in public education, because public education is government education. There's still private education that is kind of discriminatory, but it's on purpose, like an all boys school, all girls school. There are schools that they say that it's like, hey, you can only come here if you're black or if you're a minority. And that's because they're private and they don't have to take taxpayer dollars. So they're kind of exempt from that. But there is still kind of this discrimination today, but it's kind of like for like it's planned discrimination, like an all boys school, all girls school. I don't agree with them, but it's like okay, like if you want to